So Lauren, if you want to start sharing your screen, I just wanted to tell you briefly that Lauren Glevanik is a PhD candidate at UCLA's Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. Currently, she's doing research at the Sedgwick Reserve in Santa Barbara County as she investigates seed dispersal in a coastal California grassland. Also, she was our chapter's 2024 scholarship recipient. And just to let you know, we will probably be doing a scholarship again this coming year. So welcome, Lauren, and thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, for hosting me. I'm very excited to share with you all some of the research that I've been working on currently. Um, First, I want to say I hope that everyone here is physically safe from the fires that are ongoing in LA. I know it's a really uncertain and upsetting time, and it takes a really heavy toll on everybody. So um, I normally am based in West LA between Santa Monica and UCLA. And so I'm currently have evacuated from LA. I'm staying with family in San Diego while the fires are being contained. So I know many people here are based in Los Angeles, so I really hope everybody continues to stay safe and seek the support that you need from friends and family in your community right now. Um, but secondarily, I guess, thank you for taking time out of your evening to be part of this discussion and kind of little celebration of ongoing plant research. I very much appreciate the support both from the funding I've received from the chapter and in everyone's decision to attend this program tonight. And I hope you all are wildflower enthusiasts because this will be chock full of my favorite annual plants and wildflowers. Another order of my own business, I'd like to acknowledge the land where our chapter is based and where I've done my research. First, the Los Angeles and Santa Monica Mountains chapter of CNPS recognizes that we occupy land that originally and still inhabited by the Tongva, Tatavian, Serrano, Chumash, and Kizh Nation peoples. So we honor and pay respect to them past, present, and emerging as they continue their stewardship of California's lands and native flora. So tonight, I will share with you the motivation behind my research, as well as some pilot data from the field. Also show you the in-progress work that was made possible in part from support from this research grant from your chapter. And I do encourage you to write questions in the chat as they come up, and I'll revisit them at the end. All right. So first, I can introduce a little bit about the background of where I'm coming from and my work. My name is Lauren. I'm a PhD candidate at UCLA, where I study plant community ecology. I'm a lifelong naturalist and California native plant enthusiast. I'm originally from San Diego, where I'm recording now, and I lived in the Sacramento area for about 6 years before moving to Los Angeles 2 years ago. And wherever I'm moving across California, kind of the first comfort is getting to know the local native flora. So when I first moved to Central California to go to UC Davis, where I got my bachelor's in plant biology, kind of getting to know the local plants made me feel more connected to this place. So during that time, I interned at the UC Davis Arboretum and Public Garden and was designing this annual reseeding wildflower meadow as a centerpiece of their habitat gardens. So that was kind of my first part of like, oh, I love annual plants and their seeds in particular. And around that time, I also got involved as a field technician with a research team based in a vernal pool system at Jepson Prairie Preserve. Um, I know there are vernal pools in the Southern California area. I think maybe the closest is like Santa Rosa Plateau. That's definitely somewhere to put on your list for this spring. Vernal pools are so cool. An amazing type of annual grassland where water sits on top of the soil and as it evaporates, it kind of leaves behind these rings of wildflowers that are super cool. So this was my first research experience where we needed to plant very specific arrangements of these little Lasthenia, the gold fields that are the yellow in this photo. And because those seeds are so small, they were glued to toothpicks and we're planting toothpicks in the mud. Instead of being tedious, I was just thinking, this is so cool. How can I do more of this? Um, so I really got into the whole like ecology as a science and wanting to do ecology research. Um, so post graduation and through the COVID period, I still was working with seeds, but tomato seeds for agriculture, because even in a global pandemic, people have to eat. But I'm back in the ecology sphere now, and I'm currently a PhD candidate in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at UCLA with Dr. Nathan Kraft's research group. Um, I do my field work here in an annual grassland at Sedgwick Reserve in Santa Barbara County. And I'm really interested in seed dispersal and how differences in movement changes how species interact and coexist. And so the goal for this kind of research is to inform restoration and conservation plans, because if we better understand the kind of the feedbacks between how species are distributed spatially and how they interact with each other, it can help us design better seed mixes for restoration and kind of anticipate how species move and reshuffle at different rates. Um, so this aspect of community ecology that I specifically study is dispersal. And it's generally accepted that there are a few major processes that shape the formation of communities, including selective pressures like competition, drift, which is representing kind of random chance events within a community, the creation of new species through speciation, and then finally movement through dispersal. And these processes combine in different ways to shape how species interact with each other and the environment to result in patterns that we observe in real world communities. And so I've chosen this figure to represent it here as like a black box because the exact mechanisms of how all these things work together is still unknown for many communities. And they likely vary across types of communities, like animals to plants or biomes, like even tropical to tundra. So my interest in seeds and seed dispersal is kind of this major part of shaping communities. And it's particularly important for plant communities because they are rooted in place. So dispersal is usually the only opportunity for movement away from the parent plant within a plant's lifetime. So dispersal is kind of by definition important for this large scale movement, but it also shapes kind of short range species interactions, particularly in annual plant communities like this one that I currently work with, that die back and regerminate every year. Dispersal is constantly reshuffling things, and it's creating this kind of spatial blueprint from which plants can germinate and interact. Uh, but something that is kind of the motivation for why I study this is that dispersal, compared to other processes like competition, it's relatively understudied. Not as many people work on it. Um, and one reason for this is that it requires a lot of data that's time and labor intensive to get in the field. And because of this, it's easier as scientists to kind of make simplifying assumptions about dispersal. So maybe we want to know how two species will compete. And it's easier to say upfront that let's just assume any plant can disperse anywhere it needs. Or let's just fully ignore dispersal. We just want to isolate information on some other process. And this can be really useful for isolating, what's happening when they compete. But this kind of assumption fails to capture the reality of dispersal that falls somewhere between the extremes of all or nothing. We know that seeds are typically moving some distance from their parent plant, but we don't usually account for that movement, let alone considering that individual species have different dispersal abilities and they can move at different rates. So kind of some big picture questions that I'm looking to answer over the course of my dissertation, I guess, dream big here, is how common are these species-specific differences in dispersal across communities? Following that, kind of how can we account for those differences in our models? And finally, what are the consequences for biodiversity? Like, what are the consequences for understanding how communities come together and ultimately coexist? Um, and questions like this can be really difficult to address because of the systems where they're studied. So to make this feasible, I work with this annual grassland system where the plants are really fast growing and complete a life cycle within about 6 to 9 months from the time of germination to dispersal. And so this gives us an opportunity to pretty easily measure lifetime seed production and record data at when we know they're at the peak of their growth. And it also means that seed dispersal, lucky for me, is happening within this kind of predictable window at the end of the growing season. So it's pretty easy to capture the majority of seed movement for the season. So I do want to point out a couple of features of this system that make it a really interesting place for seed dispersal research. First is that there's a lot of variation in the soil environment here, particularly in the form of these patches of serpentine soil, which you can see is kind of dotted as these kind of they're kind of patches along the hillsides here. Um, and serpentine soils can be found throughout California, and serpentinite actually is California's state rock. You learn something new every day. Uh, but focusing kind of in on the Sedgwick area, there's this decent chunk of the hills here that contain this serpentine soil, and sometimes you can see it really clearly, like on the drive up to the grassland, up to my research site, you can see that there's this gorgeous, like teal green colored rock. Um, and you can even see this on satellite images. Like this one, there's this rectangular area where my plots are, and then you can see this teal blue color poking through on some of the hillsides. And the serpentine soil really matters. It's stressful for most plants because it contains high levels of magnesium and other really concentrated elements. And it's also much sandier and holds less water than the kind of the clay soil surrounding it. So another way to illustrate how stark this contrast is this is a map from my colleague Kenji, who's also worked in this area and this plant system. And he sampled soil from each of these dots on the landscape and is kind of interpolated what the soil texture is doing here, where the sandy texture of the serpentine is represented by the darker purple and blue. And we can see that if you're just looking at some of these patches of serpentine on the hillside, they're pretty well mapped by the soil texture. So it's picking up that it's sandier, it's rockier, not as good for holding water. Um, and so there's a lot of difference in the soil environment over a pretty fine scale. The scale bar down here on this map is just 40 meters total. So that there's super huge differences in the types of soil environments that are happening here. And there's also really strong fitness consequences for plants across these gradients as well. Where another result from one of his recent studies, my colleague Kenji, looked at how seed output is changing both across the soil type, so sandy soil to clay soil. Seed output changes whether or not you're growing by yourself or with neighbors. Um, so these strong soil texture gradients create really high stakes consequences for dispersal, where it really matters for a plant's performance if seeds can move onto or off of a serpentine patch. So even moving these relatively small distances creates these big differences in performance. So a question that you might be thinking is how do these species on this landscape move? Are they even going to be able to move far enough for this to matter? So let's take a look at our neighborhood species. Within this community, there are pretty interesting differences in dispersal mode. Species don't invest equally in dispersal and dispersal structures, which is to some extent reflected in the differences in seed morphology, like just the shapes here. Um, Seed movement can be limited biologically just through the physical constraints of the plant, but can also be limited dependent on how they travel, the mechanism. So the majority of species here are wind dispersed, with the exception of two. I think their names are in orange, this Acmespon ringlianus and the Euphorbia peplis. Um, those two are ballistically dispersed, meaning that as the plants dry out, the seeds are kind of explosively flung away from the plant. Um, I guess as a side note, this is an excellent dispersal method. I have been driving around Sedgwick Reserve collecting seeds because we have to source seeds locally for our experiments. And so I've been driving around Sedgwick Reserve collecting the euphorbia seeds in brown paper bags to let them dry out. And driving down the highway, and it sounds like popcorn's popping in the back of my car because they're all just kind of exploding as they're drying. And that was just the euphorbia. The Acmus pond took 6 months to fully dry out to the point where I came into my lab and kind of frantically had to tape out all the bags down because the seeds were all exploding at once. So I'm convinced there's going to be seeds on our windowsills for years. Uh, Anyway, coming back to our our entire plant community here, looking at the variation in seed shape that's present here, we could kind of intuit that there might be some differences in dispersal from even just like a physics perspective, where differences in seed shape and size and mass, and even the structural appendages like the little pappus parachutes on some of these seeds can all affect the way that they interact with the wind and therefore how they're wind dispersing. So one way that this matters is in the seed's terminal velocity, or kind of the maximum speed at which it can fall, where lighter seeds or seeds with this kind of parachute attachment often have smaller terminal velocities and can spend more time in flight compared to a heavier seed falling from the same height. And so more time in flight kind of equates to a higher chance of being caught on the wind and moving much farther. So I'm thinking about the wind patterns at this site, the height of these plants, the physical constraints that they have, and it's likely that dispersal differs across these species and that it's happening at a scale that's similar to the scale of the soil environment changes. So overall, there's kind of this really interesting context for looking at seed dispersal in the system, where we have strong differences in the soil landscape, big performance consequences for species across that soil type, and then the potential for interesting differences in dispersal happening at that scale. So kind of as a preliminary step toward investigating dispersal in the system, two things that I want to know are there important differences in dispersal within this community, and are those differences predictable? So this is kind of setting up the baseline, and then we'll look at a couple other directions after this. But one approach that I took to answering these questions was to track seeds directly under field conditions. And so my first summer in my program, I sowed these plots of mixed plant communities using 14 annual species found and sourced at Sedgwick Reserve. And I used these adhesive traps throughout the season to capture seeds right where they were falling. Um, and this is one of my adhesive mats. And I measured the distance each seed traveled from the edge of the plot. And so what this looks like is the plant community would have been planted here on the left. And so I've identified every single seed and measured how far it's traveled. And so I recorded dispersal distances for more than 7,300 seeds throughout the spring and summer season. And so I was able to get sufficient data for 10 species and found that there's a threefold difference, about threefold, between the average dispersal distances of the farthest to shortest dispersing species. And so this graph is actually on a logarithmic scale, so it looks a little condensed, but that's to keep it all on one graph, where it's kind of like pH, where a difference in 1 on this y-axis is actually a 10-fold difference. So it looks pretty close together, but it's scaled down a little. And so the statistics here are also suggesting that species are moving differently, where these top three are kind of standout. They are moving significantly farther than any of the other groups in this community. And so differences in dispersal like this create opportunities for there to be some aggregation for species that tend to stay closer to the parent, with some occasional long distance movement and some species that move farther. And this generally creates heterogeneity, or like strong differences in the seedscape, where plants are depositing seeds that are unevenly distributed for the following year's assembly. And this is very cool because these kinds of distributions often promote coexistence and like longer persistence on the landscape, rather than kind of uniform distributions. So seeing these differences in dispersal, the next question to ask is, are there simpler ways to predict this, other than going out and putting down all these adhesive mats and doing all of this work? So something that we often do in my lab group is to examine physical traits of plants. And so I chose a few things that might influence dispersal. Does like plant height or seed weight maybe help us predict in general who can disperse farther? Um, and here I'll shout out some investigative work a few of my research assistants helped me with. Hannah and Maddie looked into whether some seed shape traits might help us predict how far things can disperse. And they're, scanning their seeds on the scanner and measuring everything. And so together I ran my analysis for whole plant characteristics like plant height, and they contributed some data on seed specific things. And it turns out that seed mass is significantly related to how far things can disperse. Um, and the direction of this relationship was kind of counterintuitive to what I'd expected. If we're thinking about the physical properties of seeds, like tiny little things that are super lightweight, should be able to be carried really far by wind gusts. But kind of what we've seen in the field is the opposite, where here these heavier seeds are tending to travel farther distances. Um, and I will point out that two of the three farthest dispersing species here are the ballistically dispersed, our euphorbia and our acnispon. But even if you exclude these and recalculate the statistics, it's still supporting this trend that smaller seeds are dispersing closer to their parents. And so one thing that I think is going on for this system is that these plants are quite short and don't actually spend a whole lot of time in flight. If you were to compare maybe a 1 foot tall plant in this ecosystem to something like a 6 foot tall plant in a tall grass prairie, um, terminal velocity of these seeds might matter a lot more. Um, Dispersal here is happening kind of at a smaller scale, but it's still important because there is a lot of that variation in the soil environment happening on a similar scale. And so based only on the data that I've collected in the field, which is what's here, there are some interesting differences among species and this relationship with seed mass. The problem with this is that this is the time and labor intensive work that is the reason why dispersal is so often simplified. So I'm exploring another way to estimate dispersal without having to do this whole adhesive trap setup. So the second approach is to estimate species-specific dispersal using a pretty well-established mechanistic model called WALD, or the Wald Analytical Long Distance Dispersal. It's a mouthful. WALD uses measurements of the plant's physical properties to calculate the probability of a seed traveling a certain distance. And so this is based on things like seed release height, wind speed, seed terminal velocity. And so you can estimate the kind of the likelihood of a seed dispersing a certain distance. Like it's not giving you like a single fixed distance as an output, but rather saying like here's the range of where it would be likely to go based on its physical properties. And it's fairly reflective of what's happening in grasslands, is kind of what we see in nature, that things are variable. So one of the only simplifications it's making is that it's not considering like updrafts or turbulence, but it is fairly reflective of wind dispersal in grasslands. So I won't get too into the math here, but I do think it's really cool. So this is kind of the equation it's giving you. The probability of traveling a certain distance is given by this mathematical shape. The two main parts here are the average dispersal distance, like on average, how far is this species getting? And then the spread, like around that average, how far away from the average is kind of what's the range? And so everything listed here in blue is something that I can measure in the field. Things like how tall are the flowers and the surrounding vegetation, what are the seed properties, how fast is the wind. I actually already have much of my wind data that I'm using for this from Sedgwick Reserve. This is I love birds. I love plants. I'm a general naturalist. This is a lark sparrow helping me with my research. Um, but essentially, everything in blue I'm measuring, and everything in purple I can calculate from those measurements. The only kind of difficult thing here is actually the seed terminal velocity, this velocity parameter, because that represents the maximum falling speed of a seed, uh, which is really cool because it informs how the seed is going to interact with the wind, but kind of how do you actually isolate that? Um, there are multiple ways that researchers have estimated terminal velocity for seeds, including via like video recordings, floating them in wind tubes, or even just kind of eyeballing it with a stopwatch. But here, I think this is so clever. I've adapted a method from a researcher, Lauren Sullivan, who's now a professor at Michigan State University. This is such a cool design. So I'm using a version of it here. For measuring terminal velocity in a drop tube equipped with infrared LED sensors that can detect the timing of a seed moving a fixed distance. So the seed, it kind of falls through this tube as a runway. So it's accelerating until it hits its terminal velocity and then it's falling at a constant rate. And then as it passes through these sensors, it'll disrupt the signal. And so then my computer can detect the difference in timing between the top blip and the bottom blip, and it'll tell me how long it took to travel that fixed distance. And from that, I can calculate the velocity. Um, and so once I get this velocity, I can then predict my entire dispersal distribution and be fully like working with the model instead of doing all this physical labor in the field of doing all my seed trapping. So the seed trapping, it is still useful to make sure that the math modeling is accurately describing what I'm seeing the plants do in this habitat. But it will allow me to expand my analysis to way more species because I can measure things much faster in the field. And I will also shout out some of the work or the support I've had here, my drop tube support team. So thanks to my partner Daniel for helping me with the electrical circuitry and teaching me how to solder. And also to my dad for helping me build the framework for all the electrical stuff. So it really is a team effort here. Um, so this pilot work supports um, supports the fact that species differ in their dispersal distance within this community, and that these differences are somewhat predictable. And so we can model them based on physical aspects of the plants, like their height and their seed properties. So this is just kind of one preliminary experiment under a single environment condition. Like everything was planted at the same density of the community with the same neighbors, in the same soil. And so this is kind of a baseline. But what about in variable environments? Like we know that at Sedgwick, the serpentine grassland is really variable, and there's differences in the soil, there's differences in competition with other plants. So I'll revisit this idea I brought up a little earlier that plant performance differs across both biotic and abiotic gradients. So this previous work, for example, is showing that total seed production is affected by both the non-living environment in the form of the soil and the living environment in the form of with or without neighbors, the response changes. And so it's likely that things like seed mass or plant height might also be impacted by stress in these forms. And so this is a possibility that is not often considered, that dispersal could depend on the local conditions and how well plants are performing. I guess to kind of illustrate this point, if you're on a hike and looking for wildflowers, the very same species could look very different depending on the microenvironment where it's growing. Um, so, for example, this is not my photo, this is from my naturalist. Take this nice specimen of a dot seed plantain, Plantago erecta. These plants can be kind of monstrously big if they're in a place that they really like, or they can be really stunted but still reach maturity, just kind of depending on the stressors, the environment, what conditions they're in. Um, and thinking about just these are extreme examples, but how this might change their dispersal. The taller ones might have a much farther dispersal on average than some miniaturized form. Um, And just taking another example, this is one that I photographed on the same location, same day, like a foot away. Um, these are our Lasthenia or goldfields. Uh, they can sometimes be these kind of decent sized, robust individuals, or they can get pretty scrawny and kind of fragile. So depending on how stressed they are, the type of stress, there can be consequences for how tall a plant gets, for how many seeds are produced, maybe even also the average seed weight. But this relationship between how they're performing and how they're dispersing is really poorly understood for most plant communities. And so this kind of the subject of my ongoing experiment, where I'm really interested in figuring out how plants are responding to increasing stress. They could get really small, like the plantago, and just disperse locally, or they could get really gangly and tall to try to get their seeds away from whatever is stressing them out. So the project I'm working on now is kind of looking to assess the feedback between plant performance and dispersal through manipulating how dense the competitors are. Um, it would be a little bit hard to do this on the different soil types just because it's so spread out over the landscape. But if we know that competition density can stress out these plants, perfect. We can control everything and then just manipulate the competitor density. So I have a couple of questions to see how dispersal might change under these conditions. So under increasing competitive stress, kind of which dispersal traits change? Um, I'm planning on collecting data for traits like plant height and seed weight, that are things that are included in my math model. But I'll also be working in collaboration with one of my colleagues, another grad student, where we're also looking at a bunch of other plant traits like leaf properties and flowering phenology, like the timing. Um, so we'll actually be collecting a lot of data and kind of have a chance to see how a lot of plant traits are changing under stress. Um, and secondly, kind of do species respond differently to competitive pressure? Essentially, does everything respond in the same way? Um, Given that plant species have such a variety of strategies to be successful, I'd be really surprised if everything responded in the same way. So we'll see which species have contrasting responses. Um, and kind of in that same vein, like do responses differ based on their competitive strategies? Um, if you have something that's always a really strong competitor, does it always exhibit the same response? If you have something that's a weak competitor, is it always going to be like kind of diminutive and get really small or something? Um, to kind of walk through a couple scenarios of what I'm thinking might happen, I'm expecting there could be a few different kinds of responses depending on the species. So for example, under increasing competition, that's my sowing density from low density to high density, a species could respond by investing in vertical growth, so getting taller, um, maybe to escape shady conditions under really dense neighbor conditions. And then based on my math model for dispersal distance, if let's say this is their baseline dispersal, like they disperse within this range. If they get taller, we could predict this taller seed might disperse its seeds kind of farther, all else constant. And this kind of change uh, could enhance dispersal potential and facilitate species escaping from areas where they are bad performers. But on the other hand, something else I could see happening is intense competition for resources could limit a species, and they might respond with shorter heights if they can't acquire as many resources. And from their baseline, they might become more dispersal limited. Um, so I'm using plant height as an example here, but this kind of response might also be present for other plant traits that we're going to look at. And so, kind of a wonderful thing about this is we've never measured these kinds of trait responses to competitor density before. So, there's a lot of possible scenarios, even things that don't change at all. But we really don't know how species are going to respond or if we'll see species have contrasting responses. Um, but kind of that one final question that comes out of this is how does a species response align with its competitive ability. Where one species that's a relatively weak competitor might be more likely to be smaller or less able to get resources than a species that's more competitive. So this one, if it's not as good at competing with other species, it might end up being smaller and have more limited dispersal. So there is some work on this in the published literature already about how species experience kind of this trade-off between being able to compete well and being able to disperse. Where good competitors often have characteristics that make them really good at finding resources and using them efficiently, but those same characteristics often make them worse at dispersing. So they can't get very far, but wherever they go, they tend to dominate. And this contrasts the strategies that are at the other end of the spectrum, where these strategies for plants over here might not be the most efficient at gathering or using resources, but they are often pretty good at dispersing a lot of seeds very quickly, like kind of a weedy, like ruderal species. And so they can kind of outrun these competitors. And so this is called the competition colonization trade-off. And in theory, it would allow for these two species to coexist because their strategies and their spatial distributions differ enough that they wouldn't drive each other to extinction. So that's the one thing that I'll be looking at in this experiment is like, do we see this trade-off happening with our species? So I'm expecting to see species respond in different ways, but if I'm looking at a group of weaker competitors, are they all going to be smaller and shorten their dispersal, or are they going to reallocate resources and kind of have something else kind of more messy going on? And that's again the nice thing that we can come up with all kinds of predictions, but it's really an unknown and hard to predict in advance. So it'll be exciting to see what actually happens in the field. So it's kind of as my plan to approach this question, I'm conducting a field experiment to figure out how the performance of these 8 focal species kind of varies with different competitive strength. So I'll plant all these 8 species in the plots against a couple different backgrounds. From they're going to have no competitors in the background, a couple of lower density treatments where there's a background of mixed, all of these species mixed competitors, all the way up to kind of the average density of this community, and then a super high density. So these are hoping to get a response from the focal plants that they'll be responding to different levels of competitive stress. And so of these 5 different treatments, also 25 replicates of all these blocks. So I eventually will have 125 plots tracking 1,000 plants. So this is going to be super, super fun this year. It's in the ground right now. But the goal here, again, is to quantify how they're responding to competitor density by measuring things like their seed mass, their plant height, other plant traits, and then input that data into our math models to tell us how dispersal could be altered as a result of stress. So I can share some photos from the field of that process. This is our field site in early July this year. So once the past year's experiment concluded, I drove up and I weed whacked everything and I left all my tools right in this little box right here. And a few days after I took this photo, the landscape actually changed pretty dramatically. So this area was affected by the lake fire that burned nearly 38,000 acres in Santa Barbara County in July and August of last year. So I'm gonna show you the kind of before and after of this landscape. Kind of at the time that I took these photos, it was very terrifying. But I actually feel a lot of kind of relief and gratitude when I see these photos now. So this is what happened in August. So I can kind of go back and forth because I just couldn't believe how differently the landscape looks here. But it's at this point that I kind of also want to express a really deep gratitude to the first responders and firefighters, as well as personnel from the National Forest Service, the Chumash Fire Department, the staff at Sedgwick Reserve for working to protect not only the safety of local residents, but also for the incredible effort of protecting both cultural sites and active research areas. This kind of almost moonscape photo is from the first time I was able to visit post-fire in August last year. And so seeing kind of the lines of defense where bulldozers were creating fire breaks just around the site um, really makes me emotional. Both kind of, you know, in the moment grieving for the local area and also incredibly thankful for the crew that protected our site. Um, and actually, in fact, because the site was not affected, and all of my experiment was planned to be within the fenced area, we were actually able to get all of the seeds in the ground and plant it about a month ago. Um, so this is what it looked like about a month ago. It was actually starting to get a little bit greener on the hillsides there. So we were able to finish cleaning and setting up the site. And I took a group of volunteers up from my lab up to Sedgwick, and we took out all the old matting and installed new mats to suppress weeds and then cut the new plots. Um, and this is, and finally, I've got everything planted. So this is kind of the culmination of that work so far, where it's in the ground. And this is where I'll also thank the LA Santa Monica Mountains chapter's funding, since you all directly supported purchasing the equipment that we needed, travel for everybody to get up to the site, and helped cover our expenses at the reserve. And so I like to use as much kind of grant money as I can to pay the reserve staff, because it really, really goes back into a really great group of people that are doing amazing stewardship work and care very deeply about the research happening here. So actually, at this point, I'm also going to shout out my amazing research assistants. I know some of you are here. So I will thank all of my research assistants who cleaned all of the seed and then measured and packaged everything that we needed for the field. So thank you, Maddie, Erin, Hannah, Janelle, and Lily, for your work processing seed pods. I know it was a great podcast and TV watching experience. And for also preparing 2,000 packets of seed. You made this happen. Um, so the kind of status report of what's going on now is, unfortunately, that we're hitting another hiccup right now, which is that it has not rained this winter. So while the site is usually pretty foggy and moist, like this was the day that we planted, the clouds are just kind of lifting here. Especially with the Santa Ana winds lately, it's been really dry. Um, and so I was actually scheduled to go to the field last Friday, but due to the fires and evacuation warnings in LA, I was unable to go check on my plots. And again, thank you to the staff and stewards at Sedgwick who very kindly visited my plots and reported back on the progress. So the good news is that there's nothing actively dying right now. The bad news is it looks way drier than it should at this point, and we'll likely need to add water soon to mimic the average rainfall up to this point, and just get everything germinating. So we will be hoping for additional rain in the forecast soon, but if not, we have plans to kind of make this happen. Um, and so once everything's growing and I've got data, that's when the fun begins, where I'll kind of map out how individual species performed across these different density treatments. I'll look at which traits were impacted, how species responded differently, and I'll use that data to mathematically model any changes in dispersal. And so this is going to tell us how certain species or certain strategies that species use might respond to the increasing stress. So if something can increase its dispersal away from a stressful situation, it's like a last-ditch effort to find somewhere more suitable. And it could potentially increase the amount of time that they're able to persist on the landscape, which is both good for like coexistence, and also it's almost like it's buying itself a little bit more time to follow its preferred climate conditions under climate change. So going forward, I'm really interested in understanding how this kind of both species specific and context specific dispersal contributes to biodiversity. So as another piece of my dissertation, but a little bit further further down the line, I'll be simulating plant community assembly under different dispersal scenarios, um, really to help us figure out how much does biodiversity change when we use different kinds of dispersal predictions. And beyond that, potentially when I'm done with my PhD, I'd love to do research with a group specialized in restoration to explore how best to incorporate this knowledge into designs for seed-based restoration, which is something that, I'm super interested in and would love to get to know a little bit more applied work in that area. So this work is also potentially really useful in conservation because if we can detect patterns that link a species' ability to move with its traits, we could even take a look at a plant community in a given area that's rapidly changing and kind of assess which species might struggle to migrate, especially under stress. And then we can target those species for seed banking or intervention for conservation purposes. So really, it's not really like I'm trying to recommend a conservation or a restoration strategy here, but more trying to figure out how to give us more information to make better decisions and ultimately protect and preserve California's unique flora. Um, and also, I think part of this is like using these easily measurable and standardizable plant traits to do this can make this work really applicable to other ecosystems across the country and even globally. So yes, it's Southern California based because we need it the most here for our unique flora, but it's also work that could potentially be informative kind of worldwide. With that, before opening it up to questions, I just wanted to recognize people and organizations that made this work possible at this scale. And while this research is still kind of ongoing and honestly just getting started for the field season, I already have a lot of gratitude to extend. First to my advisor, Nathan Crafts, for his guidance and knowledge and experience and critical help with field work, and to our lab members, past and present, who've offered support and feedback and physical labor at the field, including my team of research assistants for their hundreds of hours of work. This team at Sedgwick Reserve, along with their stewards and volunteers, who are very kind and supportive, both for the landscape at Sedgwick and the researchers who use it. I'll close with another reminder that the land that we've been appreciating has been and is currently stewarded by the Chumash peoples near Santa Ynez and the Gabrielino Tongva peoples in the Los Angeles Basin and Channel Islands. And last but certainly not least, thank you to the organizations and groups that have funded this work, including your chapter of the California Native Plant Society. I really am looking forward to sharing future results and new research plans as they emerge. And with that, I can pass it back to Snowdy and open the floor for questions and discussion.
Okay. Yeah, Lauren, do you want to unshare your screen and then I have one complex question that came in through the chat, and maybe another one just showed up too. This one is very long. I'll read it. When I was in college, my biology prof was studying influences that induce the change from sexless reproduction to sexual reproduction in small Colorado plants. It seemed that the plants would reproduce sexually when it needed to disperse farther, while sexless reproduction would occur when it did not need to disperse so far. When the environment was not as harsh that year, have you looked at this characteristic? But these are annual plants. So annual plants do they do
They
sex?
do.
They do? Okay.
It depends on the species. So actually, um, do you want to come work with me? I have ideas. Um,
That's
no,
from Jacqueline O'Connor. That was her question.
yeah, thank
So,
you for your question. I love this. Thank you for like kind of justifying this recent side project interest I've had. Um, I Yeah, so that totally makes sense. Like when the environment is nice, or if it's not you have enough resources, you're not super stressed out. there is no reason to leave where you are. So you don't need to invest in that farther dispersal. Um, I think that this is really interesting in thinking about the either the self, the selfing versus the outcrossing. Um, and it totally makes sense that like especially when I was working as a as a farmer in a past life, when I worked with tomatoes, this was a thing with the inbred lines versus the hybridized lines, things that were selfing versus outcrossing, where seeds of things that outcrossed typically were heavier and a little bit better provisioned. And I guess it makes sense with what I've found in my field so far that those seeds might be traveling farther for some reason. Um, I'm really interested in that kind of question with annual plants, almost from like a pollinator perspective, where some annual plants can self-reproduce. And I would like to know, I actually don't know how much literature, how much people have actually looked at this, but I would like to know that outcrossed if outcrossing due to pollinators will produce heavier seeds or lighter seeds and what that will do for their potential like dispersal abilities. Um, I guess something else that comes to mind is kind of this, there's a researcher, I'll just say in Nancy Emery's group, I worked with some researchers at University of Colorado Boulder, I think Anne Marie Panetta and uh, Megan Oldfather, who were doing some really interesting work on the evolution of dispersal. Like, how did we get to this point where some things disperse really far and some things stay really close? And they were looking in vernal pool environments where, again, there's some harsh environments where you're outside of the water and some like uh, pleasant environments where you're like just at the right moisture. And I know that they've been looking at differences, like where some species, there's kind of an intermediate dispersal that's preferred, and it's kind of playing it safe, where no matter where you go, like if you kind of some years stay closer, some years get farther, it's kind of hedging your bets where you're going to end up. Um, I'm not sure how that it explicitly ties to the sexual versus like the outcrossing versus selfing, but it's very cool. Is there anything else that inspired that question that you want to share?
Um, Thanks for answering that. That was fascinating. I thought she was doing the research like 40 years ago, and she was looking into actually the development of sexuality in plants. Like, why did that happen? And
Mm.
so I think that's a fascinating question, and I was curious to see if you were looking at that characteristic just to see if it made a difference or not in your research. Yeah.
I think that there's a chance that it would be really interesting to look at in annual plants. Um, I I keep having to say no to extra side projects, but I have
Yeah.
something in mind for next year. Attention, all of my student assistants who are in the Zoom right now. I have something that I want to do on campus on one of we have a small nature reserve on the northwest side of campus called Sage Hill. Um, and I really want to do a sort of annual plant experiment that looks at the difference in dispersal between self-fertilization and outcrossing. Um, so upcoming work. It's still going on. It's still super interesting, and we're not at the bottom of it yet.
I know you can't do everything, so I know sometimes you just need to like focus on what you're doing. But it's just a curiosity for me. Thanks.
No, awesome. Thank you for the question.
Well, while Jacqueline's there, we'll jump to her other question,
Yeah.
which is after these fires
Mm.
were at your
Mm.
site and also our fires, do you have any recommendations about which species seeds would be best to disperse on slopes to help soil stability?
Hmm. I feel like I'm not the best person to ask the question to, but I think probably getting some sort of small annual plants. Have a wildflower meadow this year. Anything that will kind of stabilize the soil and kind of prevent, just get a root network in there. Um, so I'm not sure whether I would recommend like a specific kind of grass or seed mix, but um, if you think about kind of like what happens in the natural process of succession, like if humans were not on this landscape and we weren't trying to help it along, what would arrive first is kind of these yeah, a lot of the annual plants that have pretty small seeds, quick dispersal, short lifespans. So have an annual wildflower meadow this year. They're excellent. A lot of birds rely on the seeds. Insects rely on the hollow sticks once they've snapped in half. And so leave it up all year, and get back to it like a year from now in the fall planting season. Um, I think probably the one of the more important ecosystem services that you can be looking to restore in some of these burned areas is just that erosion control. So something that might be fast growing, if you need to hand water your wildflower meadow, that's okay. I do too, and mine's supposed to be watered by nature. Um, so no specific recommendations, but if you wanted my favorite wildflowers, I can give you some of those. But I think any sort of like local annual plant mix might be a good option. I'm not sure what sort of like I was way more tied into the local seed production in Northern California. I don't know where to recommend here, but I'm sure that there's some great seed libraries and local seed sourcing farms probably nearby.
Okay, it wasn't for me. It was just to help out in the areas that have been burned, like in Malibu or Altadena, um, in Palisades, the wild areas. If I could help out, disperse seeds, that was what I was thinking of.
That's very cool. And so it looks like
There's another
there's
question.
a reply to one of your comments, or there's some replies to your comments. Go check those out.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, it looks like some
So
people who are local. I would trust local people. I'm just an LA transplant who loves annual plants. But if people are local and have good recommendations on where to find which species you should use or where to source your seeds, absolutely.
Okay,
Um,
thank you. Thanks.
yeah.
Another question that is pending is from Stu, who said I like how you are incorporating some invasive and simulating real conditions. What influenced that decision?
Yeah, so a lot of the previous work in my lab group as a whole uh, is looking at characteristics of plants, like plant traits, and kind of using those in combination with kind of mathematical models and theories. Um, so we kind of tie the two together so we can use basically test out, is this theory of how we think a plant community is coming together, do we see that happening based on the physical characteristics of our plants? Um, and so some of that was influenced by species that we've traditionally used, or I guess historically used in my lab group. I'm also limited by what is already growing on the landscape at Sedgwick, where I cannot bring in any species that don't naturally occur on the property. So the plant community up there is made of some native and some naturalized invasive species. Um, and I'm also trying to get a kind of a wide range of functions that they're doing in the environment, where some things are grasses, some things are forbs, some things are, really good competitors and they are just kind of slow growing and tend to anchor in one place. Some things disperse really quickly and have try to produce a lot of seeds to get everywhere all at once. So I'm trying to use things with really contrasting strategies to kind of represent kind of the entire community. I'm trying to make it a kind of taxonomically diverse, where I'm not just focused all in like Asteraceae or daisies or whatever, but I'm trying to get kind of a good collection or representation from across the plant community of things that are naturally growing in this ecosystem, whether they've been introduced or not. Um, yeah, thank you for the question.
Noah's asking, where do you get your seeds for your research? Are those seeds being collected on site, all of them, or are you getting them from SNS Seeds or TPF or
I wish I was getting them from somewhere. No, because Sedgwick Reserve is part of the University of California's Natural Reserve System, they have pretty strict guidelines of what can be planted on the property. Um, so all of my seeds have to be sourced from the reserve. So that means I have to go with my little garden clippers and my gloves and my paper bags and go like seed hunting kind of in May, June, July. Um, so I source all of my seeds from the reserve by hand, and I bring all of all of my undergraduate who are in this Zoom call know the pain of picking up Amsynchia, which is that fiddle necks where
two?
they're almost like stinging nettles where they've got
Yeah,
terrible,
they're
terrible
awful.
spikes. Beautiful. I've got some Amsynchia fans in my lab. They'll defend Amsynchia forever. But it's really terrible to try to crush and process, like crush the seed or the flower heads once they're dried and leave the seeds intact. It's a lot of work, hand processing, picking out seeds with tweezers, breaking seed pods. Um, we have some like I think honestly, one of my favorite parts of doing science and research as a whole is walking into Home Depot and going down the aisles and thinking, how can I use this for something that's entirely different than its intended purpose? So we have some things for like laying mortar for bricks. We don't lay any bricks. We're crushing seed pods. It means I don't have to get prickled by Amsynchia, so it's great. Um, I guess if you're looking, I guess, for recommendations on where to get seeds, it looks like Native Seeds is great online. TPF is great. Rarer seeds grown by responsible naturalists on places like Etsy. That sounds amazing, and I would highly recommend that for your local seed sort of restoration projects. Um, in my case, I have to rely on the wonderful work of my many undergraduate assistants and allowing them to watch Netflix while they crack seed pods. Thank you all.
Ella is pointing out that just let nature take its course, and these wild areas that have burned, they probably have their own seed bank, and just stand back and don't worry about planting, I don't want to say foreign, but non appropriate seeds in the wildlands. Use those native seeds in urban spaces. And that's Anne is also saying, yeah, grow those seeds in your own gardens or in public spaces so people have a greater appreciation of native plants. And of course, then provide food and habitat for pollinators, et cetera. And yeah, I don't know what a policy might be, but in the Santa Monica Mountains, there probably isn't a unified policy on something like that. But you certainly have a policy that you have to abide by at Sedgwick. So,
And
and
I will say, I guess in that vein of restoration after fire, I think next week, I think your program is about fire restoration in the Monica Mountains after the Woolsey fire. Um, and I'm so excited for that. I don't know, your presenter next week is Miroslava, who was my
next
friend at Davis.
next month,
Um,
next
oh,
month.
next month. Well, come back to that presentation because I know she's doing great work in the Santa Monica Mountains. We both worked the same student job at UC Davis, and we're both into like plants and restoration ecology. So she'll be a great person to hear from in a couple of weeks about kind of what happens post fire in that kind of ecosystem.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm looking forward to, I think it's going to be very animal oriented, but I did ask her if there was any data on plant data. So we'll see what happens. Noah is just saying that that maybe we might be seeing big losses to our seed banks from fires like we're experiencing everywhere, and to advocate for a middle ground. And we have to, I think we have to, I think one of the things about this, anything like this, is we hurry up and want to do something when really it's best to kind of let things settle down a little bit and see what happens before we go and make mistakes. Um, Jacqueline is pointing out that, well, in the old days they used to spray ryegrass, invasive ryegrass over burn areas. Really, it's not a good idea. And I remembered one of the big Santa Barbara fires, probably about 5, 10 years ago. Somebody wanted to fly a drone over the fire area and scatter poppy seeds. And everybody's saying, why? Why would you do that? But people want to do something, they want to do something constructive and help out. That's a natural thing. And sometimes you just have to go and say, well, nature is going to maybe take care of itself, and be patient. And so, but if you have a chance and you get the opportunity to go and do restoration work, or um, help water Lauren's plots that are too dry, step up and do that kind of thing. It's hard work, but it's worthy work. Will help your research. I do want to point out too, while I'm thinking about it, as is, Lauren and other researchers like her, and I'm hoping we'll apply to present at the CNPS conference in February 2026. It's going to be at the Riverside Convention Center. I think it's February 3rd through 5th. So I'm planting the seed that people who are involved in this kind of research, you can make presentations at that conference. And usually there's scholarship money to attend, especially for students and for people in the community that are not well off financially. And it's just a wonderful conference too. Thousands of people attend it. And it's not always in Riverside. So it's in our own backyard this coming 2026. So any other questions? Any other comments? Any takeaways, Lauren, that
I think maybe I'm just thinking about this discussion about wanting to help and plant seeds and everything. And this is such a terrible plug, but I'm reading a book right now called Urban Jungle. It's gonna be all blurry, but
it is kind of blurry?
Urban
But
Jungle by Ben Wilson. And I'm almost halfway through, but he does a really, really great job about talking about how to get more greenery in urban spaces. And so uh really it is a really great effort to make your yard part of the like habitat corridor going through LA. And convince as many of your neighbors if you can give them seeds, things like that. So I'd recommend Urban Jungle. Terrible, terrible blurry, but Urban Jungle by Ben Wilson kind of is what reminds me of this discussion happening right now. So I think
okay,
yeah. Thank you all
thank
so
you.
much for
Thank you for
staying.
attending and presenting. Thanks everyone for being here. We look forward to seeing more work from you, Lauren,
Well,
and
hopefully everything will be growing and I'll have my data by the time the conference rolls around. So come see me
that
there.
would be wonderful. Okay. All right, guys. We'll see you, I guess, the next February 11th. Isn't that what I said? And it's been a pleasure. Take care. I'm going to end the program.